Please be seated. So last Sunday, we got a family text message from our son, Alden. Especially since our kids have gone off to college, Ardell and I love getting these little dispatches from their faraway lives, no matter how mundane the subject matter. This one was from Camp Mitchell over in Arkansas, where Alden and Kate are working this summer. And here's a transcript of the text. So, there's a van on the way to camp, 1995 Chevy, $800, 69,000 miles, used to belong to the Perry County Transportation Department, ... He'd actually mistyped the year and corrected himself a few text bubbles down. It was a 1985 model, not a 95. Photos followed, of course. It was really a pretty nice specimen, a two-tone industrial model with white steel wheels and those 4 of those little hubcaps that Chevy used to put on their no-nonsense model trucks. Our son was smitten. And here's the part I probably shouldn't tell you, because maybe you can forgive a 22-year-old for being thrilled at the idea of a cross-country trip in a utility van built the year his dad graduated high school. But I'm a 51-year-old guy who wears khaki pants and was recently thrilled to a really uncool degree by the installation of sod in our front yard. And yet, even I couldn't produce a single heartfelt argument against Alden's buying this van, including breaking down just outside Wichita, which is obviously bound to happen, right? Actually, breaking down outside of Wichita is precisely why one buys a 33-year-old Chevrolet van. Well, a van may not stir up your joy, but surely there is something equally impractical that does. Surely there's something your rational, responsible mind tells you that no respectable person should ever love, but your heart overrides your good taste and better judgment, and joy happens. Right where it wasn't supposed to, there's joy. Robert Capon was an Episcopal priest who wrote passionately about food for the New York Times for years, and Capon didn't believe anyone was truly a lover of food if she didn't love something embarrassing. For Capon, it was Chef Boyardee's SpaghettiOs. He knew that as a food they were objectively awful, but he'd be lying if he pretended not to love every now and then to pop the top on the occasional can of those soggy little pasta circles in that sugary Boyardee sauce. You see, I've come to wonder if the things we love in spite of ourselves tell us something essential about ourselves, which is why I've come to wonder whether joy, that deep, uninhibited joy, is the most sacred state a human being can inhabit. I've come to wonder whether joy is not a nice side effect one might experience after the real serious work of living is done, but something utterly essential to our lives, something God would have us tend to first, if tending to joy is possible. And so I love the story of King David, dancing with all his might before God as the Ark of the Covenant makes its way into Jerusalem. I love that joyous procession to lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. I should be clear, I don't love this story because I can so easily see myself as David. You can ask Ardell, dancing with all my might and before anybody is perfectly terrifying to me. But maybe a story about losing one's inhibitions is all the more compelling to those of us who really know how to keep those inhibitions politely intact, especially when it comes to our religion. Can I get a polite Episcopalian amen? It's not bad. So maybe we should back up just a step and get a little context for David's dance. In the previous chapter, David's made the king. He's first made king over Judah, the northern kingdom, but 7 years into his reign, the tribes of Israel, the southern kingdom, they come to him and say, "Look, we are your bone and flesh. While Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. The Lord said to you, it is you who shall be shepherd of my people, Israel." Israel was asking for annexation, if you will. And so the divided kingdom was reunited. David ruled over all of Israel for the next 33 years. And when the tribes of the north and the tribes of the south were made one kingdom again, Jerusalem becomes the capital. And the Ark of the Covenant is brought from Hebron up in the north to its new home in Jerusalem, the city of David, as it's coming to be called. This is the moment in Israel's long and troubled story that the Ark's procession is marking. What had been divided is being restored. What's most sacred to the people is being brought to the new center of their common life. It's easy enough to see how significant this moment was to the nation, but it is this context that makes David's ecstatic dance all the stranger and all the more wonderful. This is a solemn religious and political occasion, and the king, is out front dancing with all his might. We know Bishop Curry made a splash at the royal wedding a bit ago when he actually preached the gospel to all those people in funny, expensive hats who expected something politely dry and perfectly forgettable, as everyone knows these occasions call for. But David's dance is as if the bishop had tossed off his robes and become speaking in tongues. Actually, wait a minute. It may be worse than that. David was the king, not the priest. Maybe it's as if the Queen Mother herself were slain in the spirit as Harry and Meghan and a billion of us looked on. I could be overstating the spectacle, but only slightly. The story's very clear that David was not behaving as kings were supposed to behave. His wife Michal looks on in horror. A few verses later, she berates him. How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself. Michal's response is what led lots of us to retell this story as if David danced naked before the Lord that day, which means it's probably about time we at least let the queen exit our little thought experiment. But David did not dance naked. He shed his kingly robes, and he wore the simple linen ephod of a Levite, a religious garment, not a royal one. Let's not let this detail slip by. Remember, David's kingdom just doubled. He's twice the king he was when Israel and Judah were divided, and it is this procession to establish Jerusalem as his expanded kingdom's capital city that he lets the vestments of kingship fall away. And David falls into an ecstatic, joyful dance before the Lord. In an intensely significant political moment, when David ought to have been at his most kingly, his inhibitions go entirely away, and he dances like a child does before she learns to care who's watching. And so I wonder, what is the place of joy in your Christian life and mine? Do we see joy as a pleasant feeling that maybe we'll get to on the weekend if there's time? Or do we see a need to somehow bring uninhibited joy, as David did, into the center of our faith, our work, our politics, our relationships, our prayers? Look, if anyone's in the crosshairs here, it's your preacher. In all my years, I've never once been referred to as effusive. I'm really hoping that deep Christian joy doesn't have to involve dancing with all my might. That sounds like penance. But I do know that so often I need God to pull me out of my self-consciousness and inhibitions and into the present moment. Joy is the present tense, said Kierkegaard, with the whole emphasis on the present. So if joy is essential to our lives, and joy involves being fully transparent to this moment, how do we tend to it? How do we cultivate it in ourselves and in the world around us, especially as followers of Jesus, who traced his lineage right back to this crazy King David? Well, Friday night, Ardell and I saw Won't You Be My Neighbor, the new documentary on Fred Rogers. You should go see it. The first thing I want you to know is that the theater was completely full. We got there plenty early, and we found our two seats together on the very back row. Something in Fred Rogers' life and ministry has struck a chord today. And at the heart of this gentle Presbyterian clergyman's life, as you know, was this simple conviction that every child on earth is God's beloved, and therefore every child on earth deserves to be honored and listened to and made to feel safe. But how could gentle Mr. Rogers, in his sweaters and tie pins with his sock puppets and trains, possibly be relevant or even useful to children in a world that can be so violent and harsh and unjust? Wasn't all the joy of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood just a little Pollyanna, maybe a little contrived? The truth is just the opposite. Fred Rogers was nothing if not authentic, quirky as he was. And for all the spectacular deaths of bad guys that children would watch on television in the years to come, only Mr. Rogers stopped and actually talked to those children directly and honestly about death and sadness and loss. For all the superhero romances and breakups children would see, only Mr. Rogers talked to them about the realities of divorce. For all the fear and hatred of other races and religions, it was Mr. Rogers who washed his feet in his kiddie pool with the black police officer on his show and talked to America's children in the days after 9/11 as if they deserved to be told the truth and deserved to have their fears addressed and tended to directly. All that honesty, don't you think, all that honesty was what made room in our lives for the authentic joy of that Mr. Rogers neighborhood? The avoidance of hard truths, that's what was happening just about everywhere else on our television sets. And interestingly enough, a lot of joy seemed to be avoided over there as well. Joy really is the present tense in our lives, always. And being truly present to the moment God's given us today means being present to the difficulty as much as to the beauty. Not avoiding it, not fixating on what might be or what might have been, not distracting ourselves from it or letting worry pull us right past the beauty. To drop your defenses and open yourself to God is to open yourself to all that your life holds right now, and to trust that even if this particular moment happens to be filled with a little pain or uncertainty, facing it with honesty and kindness and forgiveness is still the best preparation for the joys that surely will come. A long time ago, a king dropped his royal robes that announced his power and his position to this expanding world he ruled. He uncovered himself, exactly as Michael said, really, in horror and embarrassment. He uncovered himself to whatever God might have had for him in that moment, which, come to think of it, must have been how the joy got in.